Hello everyone, my name is Kevin Matthews and I'm the professor for the HRM 300 at University of Maryland University College. And so today's lesson is going to be on Chapter 4, which is recruitment. I really love this chapter a lot, not as much of course as the previous one, the diversity, and then the one based on compensation, but I really like this one because this is actually an area of HR that I used to work in. I was basically it's like a recruiting manager for a district in the United States Navy. They call him the enlisted programs officer. I was his assistant, and so I got to do a lot of really cool things in order to help bring in sailors in the Navy. And actually our district, I can't take credit for this, to be honest. It was actually the person I was working for was phenomenally good at what he was doing. I'd put a shout out to him, but I don't want to make him feel bad on camera. We were the #1 enlisted district in the nation the year that I was there. So for me, recruiting was kind of a fallback career option, mostly because, if I didn't get into accounting, something I probably would have gone into is the recruiting management, and I actually had a couple potential jobs lined up before I decided to go CPA instead. Before we start, I really want to kind of get back to focusing on the kind of the minimums that we had talked about. In the previous chapter, we really looked at, we were really focusing on, diversity. And again, and I'm going to say this in almost every course, we have our foundation, which is the strategic management plan, the diversity plan on top of that, and then we have these pillars. So the goal with all of this is basically to build these foundations. Well, this is one of the first times we're going to be dealing with the pillars. And like I said, I love recruiting, so this is actually a subject that I really enjoy talking about. And one of the things that's kind of neat about it is I learned a lot about recruiting in the Navy. There's just so much that I learned, and I really enjoyed it. And hopefully I get a chance to continue teaching this, because I do really enjoy this part of the course. So in this section, we're going to talk about the recruitment process. We're going to talk about the discussion for the need for forecasting human resource needs and techniques for forecasting, be able to explain the steps of an effective recruitment strategy. Okay, so now we're going to kind of talk a little bit about the recruitment process in this section. And so the first thing we're going to do is discuss the need for forecasting human resource needs and the techniques for forecasting, be able to explain the steps of an effective recruitment strategy, and then also be able to develop a job analysis and job description. The recruitment process, and they say it's an important one. I mean, of course, what isn't? But here's the thing, recruiting, and I always told, and I remember when I was, go back to the first video that we had talked about human resources, and I said, no matter what you enjoy doing in life, I could find a job within human resources to be able to give you that opportunity to do that job. Okay, so for example, if you really love sales, recruitment's really where it's at for you. And I don't mean sales because it's, and I definitely don't mean in a negative connotation, but usually you have to have a very outgoing personality and you have to be able to sell the organization as the place to be. Now, when we're talking about it, there's, you have to do these forecasts. Now, when I was in the Navy, forecasting was, I mean, they have it down to a science. Well, I would say this down to a science. Of course, sometimes, hiccups happen during the line. And, one of the things that I was amazed with when I went to flight school was that in flight school, what shocked me was that I was told that when I graduated, they had mapped out my going through this entire process almost 2 years prior. And because I signed up for the military, I showed up to OCS July 18th of 2003, and I graduated with my wings in May of 2005. So that's practically almost 2 years. And they had mapped out that entire process of me to go through that. And if you think about it, and there's certain rules that they're able to do at various stages where they based on historical averages, they know attrition rates as you go through the training program. And then they also have a pretty good idea as to what kind of people need to get into the training programs and how those training programs can actually be, be used. And as people go through those training programs, you're going to have people who just can't make it. And like I said, they've got these historical averages that they can use, and over time they kind of average out. And so I think it's allowed them to really get good at this. And they're not perfect, obviously. I mean, when I showed up to go to flight school, there was an 8-month backlog. So it's not perfect, but at the same time, it's definitely, if you think about, getting a person from point A to point B, and here's the thing, me graduating and getting my wings was only one step in that process. There was also a fleet up training that I had to go to. Then I would actually show up to the organization that I was going to fly for. That was kind of what they were aiming for. And so there was additional time that needed to go into it. And that actually added another year onto this. So this was like an entire 3-year process to get a person in a seat flying for the United States Navy. So that kind of forecasting. Now, obviously, in your organization, you're probably not going to have to forecast like that. Forecasting like that is kind of reserved for the other larger scale kind of projects and things of that nature. But there's going to be things, and they have a pretty good list here where they talk about budget constraints, expected trend of employee separations, production levels, sales increase, decreases, and all that sort of stuff. And these are internal factors that might affect your forecast as it's going through. I could imagine that, production, human resource production forecasts were completely messed up in 2008 when the crash happened. And then, later on, we now have this great economy going on. And I'm sure that's going to be, I hate to use the word messing with, because obviously it's always a good thing if we have a good economy. But it's probably going to be changing that economy. The economy is going to be changing those forecasts, and it's going to cause a situation where there could be, some wrinkles in those changes. So, these are internal things, and look, just because they're internal doesn't mean they're controlled by you. That just means internal to the organization. But then you have external factors that might include changes in technology, changes in laws. If you're, working for a minimum wage business like, McDonald's, and all of a sudden you're forecasting for the next year as to how many people you think you're going to need to hire based on attrition rates and, training times to get them set up and things of that nature. If all of a sudden you live in Montgomery County where they were considering passing a bill to make minimum wage $15 an hour, you might all of a sudden have a budget constraint, which is an internal factor, but then you might also have changes in the laws, which is really going to dramatically affect as to whether you're going to be able to hire the people that you want to hire in order to keep up those rates. Then you also have unemployment rates. So, and I know at first unemployment rates to an HR person as far as recruiting goes is sort of backwards. In times where there's a contraction in the environment, you're going to have more people that are applying for your jobs than you're going to know what to do with. And then, we're going to probably hear in the next, few months, if we haven't had it already, run into the next problem that we have, which we all say is a good problem to have, but I don't think there really is a good problem to have, especially this one, where you're going to have a hard time filling the people as they're leaving. And so the management is then going to come to you and say, look, we don't want to focus on, recruitment. We want to focus on retention, keep the good people that we have so that they don't go someplace else. Shifts in population. If for some reason you have a new school open up, maybe they open up a new four-year university near where you work, and all of a sudden you now have all these different, bachelor's degrees, and actually where I noticed this happen before was not so much that they opened a new school, but they expanded junior colleges to include four-year degrees, which it seems like the colleges keep getting bigger and bigger and offering more and more, and so it can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. The bad part about it is, then everyone's got a four-year degree, so now how do you differentiate? That could be a problem too. You could have a flood of in the market of people who meet your minimum qualifications. Shifts in urban areas, urban, suburban, and rural areas, and then competition. Okay? So, moving on to recruitment strategy, the first thing that they really talk about is, get the staffing plan. And we talked about this in the previous videos. You get the strategic plan, then you get the diversity plan, and then on top of that, with those pillars, now you're going to have a staffing plan that's going to impact how your recruitment team is going to go out there and try to fill the jobs that need to get taken care of. You want to keep doing job analyses over time, periodically, and I set it up on a minimum 1 to 2 year cycle, 1 year, 18 months or 24 month cycle, where you're just reaching out to the boss or not the boss, but you're reaching out to the department head and basically saying, hey, it's job analysis time. Let's take a look at what your job is and how things might have changed over the past couple of years. If you're Johnny on the spot about that, writing job descriptions and job specifications becomes a lot easier. And and I know I've talked about the fact that, we in HR, and I've given you the example where we have that, they write the job description and they say, oh, we need to hire for, a staff accountant. Oh, well, I need to write a job description on that. Well, hold on one second. We pull it down and here's the job description that I've had for years, and it's the same one that I've used all the time. That gets to be a little bit convoluted, and we've talked about this a lot, especially in diversity, where if you're not keeping up with your job descriptions, all of a sudden you may inadvertently trigger some unpleasant news. You may inadvertently, because you haven't updated, so for example, if protected class minorities start increasing in the number of, decreasing in the number of degrees that are available to them, or they decrease in the number of those who have those degrees, you can inadvertently trigger an action where somebody says, well, you're just not hiring me because of, I'm a protected class, and the job that you're hiring for, you say you need a 4-year degree, but I don't think you really do, and that's where it kind of gets to be a bit of an issue. So you want to constantly be massaging those and bringing those things together. Having a bidding system to recruit and review internal candidates, qualifications for possible promotions. Internal recruiting and external recruiting. I think we've talked about this, especially in the job description, not job descriptions, and the discussion boards. And there's two different types of internal recruiting. There's internal recruiting, and then there's internal referrals. And sometimes even I get them a little bit backwards from time to time. So internal referrals, of course, are always good and nice because it's a cheaper form of recruiting. It's very budget friendly, and then that the person that's coming in, if they're a friend of the other person, chances are it's probably going to be somebody that's going to have a much better chance of adapting to your culture because they're friends with the other person who's referred them. So and I've tended to notice, and it kind of depends, because I've noticed more and more people are willing to help others get into the recruiting pipeline that may not necessarily know the person. So you want to be a little bit careful about that and ask, how well do you know this person? Because one of the things that I did when I was getting out of the military is I started making all these friends. And then saying, hey, do you mind sitting down and having coffee? All of a sudden they think I'm a wonderful person, and they're telling their boss, hey, we got to hire this guy. And all they've had was just a cup of coffee with me. Now, I love to do that when it's my job that's coming up. But sometimes that's not what's in the best interest of the organization. So you determine the best recruiting strategies for the position, and then you implement a recruiting strategy. And again, this is something it's a constant process. You're going over and over and over and over as you're trying to bring some of this stuff up. Real quick, job analysis and job descriptions. So and if you ever take the HR certification questions, they will really hammer on this. I don't know as much about the SCP, but I know the PHR, they do hammer on this, the difference between the job analysis and the description. So the analysis is the formal system developed to determine what tasks people are actually performing in their jobs. And this is usually accomplished through a survey. And so you could send the survey out to the entire staff within a specific job if you have enough staff, or you could just send it out to the person who's actually running the people in that position and ask them. I tend to like to go to the source. I don't like to ask the managers, because sometimes the managers will, they'll change things to kind of fit their needs. So they'll say, well, this is what this person does, but that's not what they're really supposed to be doing, but they should be doing this instead. Sometimes that can, sometimes managers have unrealistic expectations of what their people should be doing. And you want to make sure that you're hiring for the person to do what they're actually going to be doing, as opposed to unrealistic expectations. From the job analysis, we then write the job description based off of what's part of that survey, and then of course additional feedback from other areas. Okay, so in figure 4.1, where they talk about the process for writing job analyses, I really like this diagram. It's very easy to follow, and it does definitely have it's a pretty good method, and this doesn't just have to be for job analyses. This can also be for some other survey writing that's actually pretty good for that. And then they also have 4.2, where you have your sample analyses. So when we're talking about two types of jobs analyses that can be performed, there's really two. They fall into two broad categories, and one of them is that there's a task-based jobs analysis, and then there's a competency or skills-based. I have more experience doing more of the task-based ones. Oh, no, I'm sorry, not task, but yeah, the task-based analysis, as opposed to the competency or skill-based analysis. And that's where you're just kind of going in and, you're focusing on the duty of the jobs, and not really worrying so much about the level of competency that the person actually needs in order to get that done. And the reason why I was more into that is that I was assigned to a project that really wasn't looking to do the analysis based on the competency level, and was more focused on the task. So that's kind of how I got to be able to do that. An example of a task-based analysis might include the following information, and they give you about 5 things that they do. Write performance evaluation for employees, prepare reports, answer incoming phone calls, assist customers with product designs, and cold call 3 customers a day. So when taking a look at it from this perspective, that's a task-based analysis. With the job task analysis, the specific tasks are listed and it's clear. With competency-based, it's less clear, more objective. And so, like you say, ability to analyze data, ability to work within teams, and then the adaptability and the innovativeness of the actual employee. And I mean, if you want to talk about measuring innovation, that's a pretty difficult thing to do. And that's why I always love task-based ones. They're really easy to do, in my personal opinion. So, they kind of talk a little bit about that. Once you decide if a competency-based or task-based is more appropriate for the job, you can prepare to write the analysis. And unfortunately, this is a 300 class. It's not a master's or a doctoral level class where we would actually be able to talk about different philosophies and research methods and things of that nature. But there's definitely some things that I think could be employed from that. That should actually encourage you to go get the master's degree in human resources, especially if you get a chance to do some investigative work or some research work in that area. So, and the reason why I kind of bring that stuff up is that there's different types of things that we talk about in doctoral research. For example, am I going to do will I do focus groups? Am I going to do interviews? Am I going to do observation? Things of that nature. And so it's, a job analysis, it's usually, it's very dependent on the type of industry that you're going to do. And it's also going to depend on the kinds of employees that you're going to be dealing with. So for example, and I kind of liken it to theory X, theory Y. If you think about employees as more theory X, you're probably going to, you're going to have a completely different set of job analysis than if it was sort of theory Y. Theory X being, they kind of see employees as lazy, they kind of see employees as a cost, they kind of see employees as, not necessarily assets, whereas in theory Y management, the employees are the key to the competencies, they're the key to the success of the organization and things of that nature. And there's people who feel both ways about it, and so it's not I personally think that theory Y is better, and I think anybody who's watching this video would probably feel the same way, but but there are definitely a lot of theory X managers out there. And then there's 4.3, which actually has a job analysis, an example of a sample job description. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead. So, I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead, yeah. Once the job analysis is complete, then it's time to sit down and write the job description. And that's kind of where this is all leading to, and this is why, like I said, when you get down with it, the analysis is going to kind of write it for you, but there's going to be some wordsmithing that you're going to be able to do with it. But for the most part, the analysis is going to be where it's going to really function into that. So obviously, once you've written it, you're going to get the permission to the get the hiring manager to approve it, and then you can begin recruiting for the process, recruiting for the potential fill. Okay, so in this section we're going to focus on law and recruitment. They say, explain the Immigration Reform and Control Act, the Patriot Act, the Equal Employment Opportunity laws, and how they relate to recruiting. This is kind of where we get into the what can get you into trouble in recruiting. It's a lot of fun. I always kind of enjoyed it. I used to fly in the Navy for a living, and there's an old saying about fighter pilots. When a fighter pilot walks in the bar, how can you tell? Don't worry, they'll let you know. I've met a lot of recruiters who kind of feel the same way, and they tend to, especially if they're professional recruiters, they're usually very good at sales. They're very very good at what they do, but there's definitely a box from which everybody has to operate within, and if they don't operate within that box, it can cause a lot of problems. And the first controlling factor is the Immigration Control Act in '86 of '86. It requires the employers to attest their employees' immigration status, and it also makes it illegal to hire or recruit illegal immigrants. Now, I really want to talk about this for a specific reason, and that's because, of course, events that have taken place, I would say in the last 6 to 7 years, there has been more. I would say it's still the law that you're supposed to be following with this, but definitely there's been some enforcement, in talking to some people, I guess it kind of depends on the industry. A couple construction people that I was dealing with, they said, oh no, they're still cracking down on us. But I've seen where some other areas that they're not really feeling that as much. And there's a lot of, ambiguity, particularly when it comes to, like, for example, the DACA recipients, and so it can cause a little bit of stress for us, simply because of the fact that the last thing you want to do is break the law. Okay, the last thing you want to do is break the law, and so but at the same time, you also don't want to say, hey, we got to fire you because we can't verify your status. But sometimes that's where you kind of have to put the needs of the company ahead of your own personal quorums and quals. And so we again, make sure that we're doing that, and if you run into any issues or you think that this might be somewhere that you think there's a lot of gray, and you don't want to do the wrong thing, it never hurts to seek legal counsel. Never be afraid to contact your organization's legal counsel. And if you're the HR head and you don't have access to the legal counsel, you probably want to convince them to make sure that you've got that. Another area that this kind of relates to, and it's more of a tax issue, but it can also hit you pretty hard as a recruiter too, is employee versus contractor. I do some payroll accounting also, and so this is always kind of a big question: is a person a contractor or an employee? And of course, most people want to make them contractors so they don't have to do withholding. Well, the IRS cracks down on that pretty hard, and so what they did, it used to be they had a and I can't remember if it was a revenue, I think it was a Rev-Proc or it was a Rev ruling, I can't remember what it was, but it basically outlined something like 20 different factors that they would take into determining if somebody was considered an employee or if they were considered a contractor. And a few years ago, the IRS rescinded that and basically said, we're not going to do that anymore. It's all facts and circumstances. And one of the biggest things that they get to is kind of this idea of control. How do you control your employee? Do you tell them that they have to arrive at your work at one time and then they can only leave after a certain time? Another thing is working for potential competitors. If you tell them, and let me take it from a flip side, not so much from an employee side, but let me take it from contractor side. So if you have a plumber that's coming to work at your house, are you going to tell the plumber who's coming to work at your house, hey, yeah, I want you to fix my stuff, but I don't want you to go across the street and fix the stuff of my next door neighbor that I don't like? Or I've got a competition going, and say you're one of those competitive neighbors that, like the Joneses, and down this street here, there's 2 houses down, there's somebody I don't like and I don't want you to work for him. No, it's ridiculous. You would never tell your plumber that. First of all, they'd laugh at you, and then second of all, they'd probably go do it anyways. But and that's living proof that plumber and you relationship is definitely a contractor relationship. And so it's just things like that you can kind of run into as with that. And then of course, and actually I just realized I forgot to talk a little bit about two main documents that you're going to have to get from people. There's a INS I-9 form, and I'm sure all of us have seen it before. If I showed it to you, you'd be like, oh yeah, I know that. That's the passport, driver's license form. So they want you to bring in, they say if you bring in one of the items from column A, we'll establish that you're both your identity and your right to work in the United States. If you bring things from column B, you also have to bring things from column C in order to establish, because column B deals with the identification of you, and then column C is your right to work in the United States. So, and a very good example of that, if I bring in my passport proves that I am a United States citizen. And as a result of which, it not only identifies me as who I am, but it also identifies that as a United States citizen, I definitely have the right to work here. Okay. If I bring in, for example, my driver's license, well, my driver's license establishes my identity, but my driver's license in and of itself does not establish that I have the right to work in the United States. Again, if I bring in my Social Security card, that establishes that I have the right to work in the United States, but it does not establish my identity. I could pull that ID card, a Social Security card from anyone. So there's that's kind of the reason why they do those forms. And they do have an example of it. It's kind of small, on 4. And they kind of talk a little bit about, some of the things. Actually, I would download this from the internet. I'm sure that they're all over the internet, and then take a look at it. It's actually pretty good. Then we have the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was passed as a result of the 2011, September 11th, 2001 terror attacks. it gives there's actually, I mean, there's a wide range of powers afforded to the executive branch under this. One of them is that employers need to implement new procedures to maintain employee privacy rights. The act also amended the Communication Privacy Act, allowed federal governments easier access to electronic communication. And then the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. A lot of you, in communications of an employee suspected of terrorism, and the government does not have to reveal this surveillance to the employer. So if this happens to you, my recommendation, make sure you get good legal counsel and then go from there. Talking about the next things, we did discuss EEO laws in Chapter 3. They talk about how we need to mention them again. This, and it's kind of funny because I remember when we said, I remember when I was younger, and I said, I got the application to go work at McDonald's, and I was filling it out, and on the bottom of this they said we're an equal opportunity employer, and I was kind of looking at that going, well, and everybody, why is that a big deal? And basically what someone mistakenly told me, oh, well, that just means that they're gonna they have the right to discriminate against you if they want to do that because you're not a protected class. That's not fully what it means. What it means is that by saying you're an equal opportunity employer, you're going to abide by the EEO's policies and procedures in order to attract people, and it's sort of a way of telling people that says, hey, look, we follow the law here. But it also commits you to actually doing a lot of the things that the EEO wants you to do. So make sure that you definitely do follow those. These are just some examples of the EEO policy or EEO statement that you can actually put down on your in your applications, and I'll just let you read that through. Let's talk about BFOQs once again. It's a quality or attribute that's reasonably necessary to perform the operation of the business that can be used when considering applicants. We talked about this in the previous video where I said, hey, this is like for actors. If I'm going to be filming the movie Glory, which was about the first African American soldiers that were brought into the Union Army. I have a BFOQ to hire people to fill certain roles. For example, if I'm going to have them fill in the, Denzel Washington's character role, I'm not going to hire a white person to do that. I need somebody who's black to be able to play that role in order to make it believable. That's my favorite version of what the BFOQ is, because I think it's crystal clear what that is. Now, sometimes it gets a little hairy-carry. I think another example is that if you're required to operate a machine that requires the use of two hands, obviously if somebody has a disability where they can't use those two hands, it could cause a safety issue, and as a result of which we have a BFOQ not to follow that area of the ADA in doing that. So there's definitely some examples where other than just the actors. They give you a couple examples. And one of the things that I see that they say, first of all, seek legal counsel if you're going to write a description, if for some reason you think a BFOQ is going to be necessary. And they give you a couple examples of what is not qualified as BFOQs. For example, a requirement of a high school diploma. I remember, when I went to go work at McDonald's when I was younger, they did not require a high school diploma in Idaho, but they did in Washington State when I was there. And so, I find it interesting because it pops up here, and I remember there was a kid that used to work for us that was very good at what he did, but due to some in-home abuse situations, it was not, it was mostly emotional and physical. But he didn't have a chance to finish high school, and as a result of which he needed this full-time job in order to keep things going. So he would not have been able to find that work if the Washington State one had taken place. They do like height requirements, awarding pay raises on the basis of say fewer than 5 years of experience. You know, so okay, so in this section we're going to talk about recruitment strategies, where we talk about explain the various strategies that can be used in recruitment. You know, and this is kind of where we get more into the fun stuff. You know, where they talk about recruiters. Some organizations have specific individuals that focus solely on recruiters. These are going to be like your bigger companies. And I keep using one of my companies I used to work for, my third accounting firm. I don't name them, even though I think they're a phenomenal company, just because I don't have their permission to name them. I know that they have hired a person who does recruiting. I mean, they work on a part-time basis, but because in the accounting industry turnover is just so much, it's generally about 2 to 3 years for an accounting firm. Not so much in the tax department, but in this company, but more in the audit department. But they hired a part-time recruiting person that kind of comes in and just does recruiting the whole time. You know, then you have, you know, you could, there's also different types of firms that specialize in this, executive search firms. I think ladders, it used to be a very good example of this. They wouldn't touch a job unless it was paying $100,000 or more, which in the Washington, D.C. metro area doesn't sound like a whole lot, because usually people, after they've had a few years of experience, can usually climb to that level pretty soon. But, you know, outside the Washington, D.C. metro area in New York and San Francisco, you definitely would see, like in Abilene, Texas, you make $100,000, you're rich. You know, and some people may not know this, but the top 10% in the United States household income is $137,000, and that's based on some congressional records that I know. The temporary recruitment or staffing firm, you know, I think a very good example is Kelly's. There's also Account Temps. That's one that I've heard of. Yeah, and they talk about it here. Manpower, Snelling Staff Services are examples. A lot of times people go work for these for a variety of reasons. For example, if they, you know, they want to go work, but they don't necessarily need the money. They'll go work for a staffing firm like this because then it's kind of project based. Some people, and especially when you have lower, when you have a, you know, the economy's doing really horrible. What will end up happening is people will go work for staffing companies, and then the companies will usually hire people out from the staffing companies, test them out for a little while and see if they like them, then they'll bring them in if they need them. But it's kind of an outsourced way that they'll handle the manpower thing during bad times, and so. But it can also turn into a full-time job. Then you have, you know, like they said, the corporate recruiter who's an employee within the company and focuses entirely, and that's the example that I gave you about my friend, or not my friend, but my third company that hired the recruiter that does that. So. Contingent recruiters only paid when the recruit starts working. I remember when I was hired for my second firm, the recruiter who worked on my behalf, she ended up getting, I think the fee was like 3.5 times my monthly salary. So that's a lot of money. Now I had to work there for at least, I think it was like 6 weeks before she actually got the money, and obviously I did that and more, but you know, and then later on I actually got laid off from that company because, and I didn't know it at the time, but they were actually going through a buyout, and they didn't announce it to me when they let me go, but I'd only been there for like 6 months. They said, look, we're choosing you because you're the junior person, sorry, deal with it, and I was okay with it because I ended up in my third company and I was very happy. Campus recruiting, you know, when I worked at the Big Four, there were two different types. I mean, there were two different types of recruiters, so to speak. There was the experienced recruiter, and then there was the college recruiter. And especially with, you know, a lot of the Big Four, what ends up happening is they're very involved in the campus because they want to bring people in. You know, most of the time what will end up happening is people will go to the Big Four, they'll usually work for about 3 or 4 years, and then they vamoose. And their organization being a pyramid, so to speak, on this, what happens is, because it's got the pyramid, obviously people falling out at various stages is not necessarily a bad thing. Because then they can kind of weed who's going to be able to stick around and who wants to leave. The big thing about that is, if you go work at a campus recruiting, you go to colleges all the time, shake hands, kiss babies, and all of a sudden, you're trying to bring more and more people into the organization. I would say nowadays, as opposed to say 20, 30 years ago, usually what ended up happening is 20, 30 years ago, most people had absolutely no experience when they were coming out of college. I would say that internships have flourished a lot lately, and as a result of which, you might actually get somebody who's done some intern work that's just fascinating and interesting, and ends up leading into a pretty good deal. Another thing I like about the campus recruiting, there's some companies that really specialize in this, and a very good example is Enterprise. That's where I always get all my rental cars from, and I remember they tried to hire me when I was getting my master's in business because they said they wanted me to bring me into their management training program, and it was, they do hire people that don't have degrees, but then they try to hire people with college degrees to come in their management training program, and then they can actually become store managers in a relatively quick time. It's a very formalized program once you do it, and usually they, like I said, people do it for a few years, and then all of a sudden they go off somewhere else and go be a manager somewhere else. But it's a good thing. And then there's another organization. I don't know if I want to mention them, but because they're not really that big here yet. But they also, I know a lot of organizations. They have these professional programs where they do that. So. Professional associations, they're nonprofits with the goals to further a particular profession. Very good one is SHRM, and if you are not a member of SHRM and you're getting a degree in human resources, you're wrong. You need to, and I'm not saying that you have to do this in order to maintain your good grades, but you really have to consider SHRM membership, because SHRM membership is how we continually build on our learning that we've learned here in college. With that, I've gotten to do some really cool stuff as a result of my membership with SHRM. And I talked a little bit about the Council for Immigration. That's a great organization. They've actually been merged into SHRM here recently, and so it's a pretty awesome opportunity to do some stuff. But you could go work for some of these other organizations that are out there, Professional Nursing Association, Society for Women Engineers, and some of these guys, what they'll do is they'll have recruiters that work with them with the intention of helping people get into these industries. Especially organizations like Society for Women Engineers. I know they've been really working hard to decrease the gender gap that existed and still exists to this day in the engineering industry. And then there's some union shops that'll actually do the same thing, because sometimes, and it depends on the state, and we haven't talked about unions yet, but we'll talk about it later on. But with unions, what ends up happening is you have what they call open shop and closed shop. So closed shop basically means you don't go to the company to apply for the job. You go to the union. The union brings you in, and then they'll get you the job at that point. Whereas with the open shop, it's it's different. You go get the job, and then you become a member of the union. So websites, I think internet-based recruiting, I'm becoming less of a fan of this than I was, say, 15 years ago. One of the problems that I have with a lot of the internet-based recruiting, what ends up happening is I think it's gotten bad on both sides. First of all, you have a whole bunch of candidates that are applying for anything under the sun, even if it remotely relates to anything that they do. And then on the other hand, because they have this huge swamp of resumes that come in, human resource departments never go through the resumes. What they do is they get these programs that go through and munch through the data, and metadata analytical computer programs that basically they're looking for keywords, and if they get register the right amount of keywords, it pops up the resume for the recruiter to look at it. I'm not so sure how effective they are, because I've applied to a lot of these. I know a lot of people who applied through a lot of these, and they are not very happy with the results. So I tend to be more of a LinkedIn, and we're talking about social media down here: Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, MySpace. If you are a student in my class, please feel free to link with me. I have probably about 2,000. Is it 2,000? I'm probably up to around 2,000 by now. People that are associated with my LinkedIn account, and I'm willing to introduce you to anybody that could lead to a job. And I've had a few students who have done that, come on board and basically said, hey, I noticed that you are linked with this person, and even if I don't know that person very well, I'll still set up the relationship and just say, hey, look, I know this person, they used to be in my human resource class, blah blah blah. And sometimes just having that personal introduction can get you through some doors that you wouldn't have otherwise. Facebook, I wouldn't use Facebook so much for job searching if I were you. It's not necessarily a place that I would, but actually, let me talk about this for right now. So Facebook, if you have your Facebook account and you're going to start doing your job searching, you might want to clean up your Facebook account. It's one of those things that people are looking. I mean, you tell me you want to come work here, I want to look at your Facebook account, because you do stupid stuff on Facebook. I don't want you working for my company, is what a lot of the recruiters are going to say. Twitter's kind of the same thing. People will look at your Twitter feeds and see what it is that you're retweeting and what you're saying on Twitter, and see if you're doing anything that's disparaging. YouTube, obviously, you can tell I like to use YouTube a lot. I use YouTube for a whole host of reasons, and I'm planning on expanding that here in the next few weeks. MySpace, I didn't even know this was still existing, but my son tells me it's still out there, so I guess it is. I'm going to talk about another one where they didn't mention this on here. So, they talk about the goal of using social media as recruiting tools, creating a buzz about your organization. If you are the HR manager, using Facebook in order to get news out about your information is a good idea. There will be people who will follow your company that want to work for your company, and that's a good way to constantly be sending out stuff that's, and some of the stuff, I do this all the time. I follow a few companies that I really like, but most of it's just kind of like, oh yeah, that's like a press release. You'll kind of want to do something that's really cool. Send out polls, send out other things. Do your wacky picture of the day that you did at your office. As long as it's not unprofessional, of course. So it ends up actually being very helpful and actually humanizing the company, as opposed to if you're just sending out just press releases. It's kind of like, okay, well, that's nice. Other companies do the exact same thing. You can have events. I'm a member of the Chamber of Commerce, and here in Washington, D.C. metro area, we go to the Microsoft building all the time, and they actually have some really cool events that they put on for us, and it's really neat. It really gets people kind of interested in working with Microsoft, and since they're a prime contractor, and many of us are, subcontractors that want to work with prime contractors, this is a good way to do that. So then they talk about special interest groups, referrals. Referrals are kind of the big, huge thing that, and like I said, now it's gotten to the point where, even on places like LinkedIn, you can do LinkedIn version of referrals, which are very, very helpful. Like I said, it can help you find people that you might otherwise not have given much of a chance, but because somebody has come to you and said, this is a good person, you need to talk to them. It might help you make a sale that's actually really good. And a lot of this stuff, they give you some really good ideas. If you decide that you wanted to become a recruiter, this is probably some good things to keep. They talk about cost of recruitment, cost per hire, where they talk about all the different costs that go into it. This is something that a lot of times managerial accountants will figure out for you. But of course, you need to make sure that you're keeping your numbers good so that you've got your stuff done. All right, so that's about all I've got. There's not much else I can add to this topic. There's a case study actually after that, but I'm gonna wrap up here. If you have any questions and you're in my class, please feel free to send me an email. I haven't been getting any emails from anybody, so you know, I'm assuming everything's good. You know, I've been talking to people on the groups, so hopefully that you know, we'll continue doing that. You know, and if you're not in my class, please feel free to leave a comment in the box below, and then what we'll do is I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I want to say thank you very much, and